Welcome to Reflections on Identity, a podcast series exploring educators' narratives on their professional identity. Today, we are talking to Mark Tinney, who is a digital technology coach and teacher educator. Mark, as always, we start this podcast just getting you to explain a little bit about your role. So, could you do that first for us, please?
Sure. Yeah. My background for the last 10 years has been in teacher education, initial teacher training, which I've done through the University of Bedford and now the University of Huddersfield. And this last September, I took on a role as a learning technology coach. So it's sort of like an AP or an advanced practitioner where I support teachers across the college group, but with a digital focus. So my area of expertise is technology in the classroom. I'm working on my PhD looking at the impact AI has and how FE institutions respond to AI. So the impact it has on the FE sector and how FE institutions respond. So I support teachers across the organization in thinking about how they can use technologies, the latest technologies like virtual reality, 3D printing, AI, and so on in their curriculum.
Great, thanks, Mark. Do you think that your role influences your identity as an educator?
I definitely do. And I think my particular interests as they've developed in the 20 years I've been teaching has led me toward that role, if that makes sense. So that
Mhm.
as my professional identity has developed, which it changes over time, I suppose, in many ways, I would argue that initially my area of interest in my professional identity was around creative and innovative practice, right? Just finding out or discovering creative ways to deliver content that learners engaged with that went beyond just teacher talk and chalk and talk from the front of the classroom. And then eventually, as the technology developed and changed over time, I started using technological tools to do that, to achieve that. So starting out with using digital whiteboards and moving on to Web 2 technologies and taking off from there. So in a way, I would argue it's twofold that my professional identity as it's developed has led me to the role, but being in that role and given this is a new role within our organization, uh, my professional identity continues to develop as I define that role and what it really means across the group and help people understand what that is.
So, would you say then that identity, particularly when we're talking about professional identity, is that something that is important to you?
Absolutely. And it's certainly what led me to teacher education in the first place and my interest in that because I'm quite passionate about education in general and the impact that we can have and recognize that in many ways the education sector, I think both here and in the US, my home country, has been very much on the defensive, in many ways being used as a political football, that educators are to blame for our problems and industrial decline and to blame for lack of GDP growth and all of those things. And I think it has damaged the profession in many ways. But certainly in the U.S., when I left there in 2006, it was quite common for people to argue that teachers were overpaid because they get their summers off and things like that. And that's obviously not the case because teachers work so many hours during the week. They work those summers in advance.
Mm.
So I do think that I've grown to be quite protective of the profession. And I always saw that as my role as a teacher educator in making sure that people were prepared for what the profession really entailed and would ask of them. And I used to tell my trainees that I didn't see my goal as getting them through the course, that my goal was to help them survive their first 5 years.
Yeah, so I'm quite interested to know then how, because your role's quite distinct, isn't it? And you have this dual element to it. If we met for the first time and I asked you what you did, how would you describe your role?
That's an
What would you
interesting
call
question.
yourself?
A couple of years ago, I would have said, and this sounds really pompous in a way, and perhaps a bit of hubris, but a couple of years ago, I would simply have said, I make great teachers. And that's how I see my role. Now, having shifted into this new role, I think I would say that I help teachers produce great learning by helping them think about how technologies can enhance and improve what they do on a day-to-day basis.
Interesting. So we'd normally ask whether you saw the two things as distinct, for example, identity and the role. But I think you've taken quite a different approach to that when you've been describing it almost, being led, your identity leading you to the role rather than the other way around.
I think that's perhaps how I would argue it, that in some ways, and I'm very lucky in this current role, that I would argue it felt like it's almost been written for me. That the role is me as a teacher, and the way that I've been supporting teachers really going back as far as 2004, when I started doing smartboard training for a group of Montessori teachers when I taught in a Montessori school. So I suppose my current position makes me lucky enough to be able to say that. But I think, yes, my area of interest and developing expertise through my professional identity has led me to the role that I'm currently in.
Right. And how much influence do you think context has had over that? So where you are?
Oh, I think that's massive. And it changes. One of the things that I think all teachers have to be prepared for is that your professional role will continue to develop through your entire career. Your professional identity, excuse me, will continue to develop. And that is often context specific because you rise to the occasion you face. And that may be you have a particularly difficult or challenging group of learners that force you to become an expert in behavior management, for example. It may be that you have a particular passion that you pursue and that drives you in a direction, or that you just discover something new that you've never tried before and suddenly you're chasing that rabbit hole. And I think that's where I certainly view my career and my professional identity, that it has developed over time, and new technologies, even though I'm steering in that direction, because the technologies keep changing and developing, my identity is changing and developing with them. So now within this organization, I think most people would argue or would see me as an expert in embedding things like 3D printing in the curriculum and certainly AI in the curriculum. Whereas if you asked a few years ago, it would have been focused on Web 2 technologies and systems, training and ProMonitor and those kinds of systems. But I think my professional identity has changed and developed with the technology that's come out.
Do you mind if I come in just quickly, Carol, if that's okay, if that's all right with you and Mark, because it's just that you've talked about AI, Mark, and that's obviously what your doctoral work is currently on, and it's such a hot topic at the moment, and I suspect it will carry on being a hot topic. But as somebody who has got expertise in and around that area, do you have any sort of thoughts on how AI might affect your identity and other teachers' identities going forward? Or is that too does that smack too much of science fiction at the moment?
Well, I don't think it does. I think, again, part of my interest in the PhD work is around whether it lives up to the hype. Does AI really live up to the hype that it's being given in media, both here and in the US, in terms of its impact on education? Because as teachers who've been around a while, we've heard this all before. when Web 2 technologies came out, we were like, oh, education's never going to be the same. When COVID happened and we all started teaching online, oh, education's never going to go back to being the same. And in some ways it hasn't, but it certainly hasn't changed our role and our job so drastically. And I would argue that many of the new technologies, information systems that we use in schools and colleges, the VLEs that we use, they haven't reduced teacher workload. I would argue they've increased it, and in all kinds of ways. I see AI as a potential, perhaps, to finally start to reduce that teacher workload. And I'm quite interested in whether it actually does that and what the barriers teachers face, because that's the hype. And I think some people have this view that it will replace teachers. And my argument would be that if COVID taught us anything, it is that learners miss the relationships they had with teachers, and that being in the classroom and having those relationships develop over time is vital. So the argument that AI is going to replace teachers, I think, is misplaced. I think it will change the way we deliver and hopefully support teachers in being more creative in that delivery and open up new opportunities, like asking Copilot to play the role of Julius Caesar so we can have a conversation with Julius Caesar. Yeah, we can do things like that now, but I don't think it will do more than simply enhance the role that we do. I think the idea that it will replace teachers is that's the science fiction part. We're not there, and nobody, until you can Matrix style put a needle in the back of my head and I've learned jujitsu in 30 seconds. I don't think it will replace the importance of relationship building and learning, and AI is not going to do that.
Okay, thanks, Mark.
Thanks, Neil. I just have one final question, really, and I think you might want to answer this with your teacher educator head. What challenges do you face as an educator, and maybe those educators that you're working with, in terms of developing professional identity?
That's a really interesting question, and I think my initial answer is certainly with my teacher educator hat on, because initially I think certainly for the first 5 years, and I say 5 years because in FE currently, as of 2021, teachers within first 5 years, 62% of teachers leave FE, and that's insane. That number is absolutely nuts. So that means the teachers who started in 2016, by 2021, 62% of them had left FE. And so when I say 5 years, that's where that comes from, because after that, the attrition rate does start to decline, thankfully. But part of that is because for the first 5 years, my argument is, and in my own experience, I don't think you feel like you really know what you're doing or that you're any good, particularly at what you're doing, because you're still learning. And every year is a completely new set of experiences. And those first 5 years is building up the bank of tools that you need to address those new experiences and figure out what to do. So I think in the first 5 years, it is about, most teachers, the barrier they face is that it's about survival rather than forming my professional identity. I think that happens more after those first 5 years, where you're confident enough and you figured out what works for you and what doesn't. That's when your professional identity really starts to take hold, from my perspective, that you've got enough experience under your belt that you really know. And I think for a lot of trainee teachers, and I'm sorry, this feels like it's a winding answer, but for a lot of trainee teachers, that's also about finding their niche. So when I started out, I wanted to teach, year 6 and 7 in the States. So, 11 to 13-year-olds. And here I am teaching HE and training teachers in college, at an FE level and at university levels. So it is not always where you thought you were going to start out. And sometimes it's finding the area that's the best fit for you. I've had teachers who struggled in an FE setting and then gone into an SEN setting, and suddenly they were shining and excellent at what they were doing. So it's also about having the patience and resilience to recognize you've got to find the right fit. And once you do, that's when your professional identity starts to take root.
Good. Neil, did you have any further questions?
No, I think that's a lovely way to wrap up, Mark. And thank you again for. I think it's fascinating the technology part, the digital part, and the teacher education part, and giving us a sort of an overview of how you kind of position yourself in relation to those has been really insightful. So thanks, Mark.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you for joining us, Mark. Some really interesting insights there.
You have been listening to Reflections on Identity. We hope you can join us for the next episode in our series. So click on the bell icon or follow for notifications. We'd also love to hear from you. Please put your thoughts in the comments. Bye for now.